Hi everyone, and welcome to this hour-and-a-half long bonus tutorial on painting black fur on UART pastel paper. Now UART is new to me. I used UART 400 grit for this, but I'll speak a little more about that in the tutorial. First time on this paper, and it was a really good experience, so I hope you enjoy seeing this. And as always, here are the colours I used in the painting, and I'll share those as I progress. So for the first 5 minutes or so, I'm going to quickly talk you through how I worked the background. And this paper was new to me, so the background was a bit of an experiment. And here I'm using dark 13, starting to block in some of the cushion in the background. And it's all lovely, rich purple tones. I purposefully put Harry McClary, my little dog who I photographed, in front of some really nice vibrant cushions which suit a lot of his highlights. And now using BV5 on its side, I'm really just blocking the rest of the cushion in. So I've created some of the darker lines in the cushion and now using a slightly lighter purple just to block the rest of that in. So I'm not showing you this in real time as I want to focus on how I created the fur in this tutorial. But I am going to come back and do cushions and soft fabrics tutorial very soon, as that's something I get to paint a lot of. And I still haven't blended any of this pastel into the paper. I really wasn't sure about its blending abilities just yet. I'm focusing on trying to layer in some colours, putting some warmer tones down first. And I haven't actually rubbed anything into the paper yet. So I just begin to do that now, pushing some of the pigment into the fibre of the paper. And I very quickly realised that with this paper, it's extremely sore on your fingertips if you rub it for a long time, as you do throughout a painting. So I will definitely experiment with some other blending ideas next time on this paper. I have some other tools, paper tortillons, rubber blenders, things that look a little bit like makeup applicators. So I'll experiment with those next time. But I persevered in this one, and I did have a bit of a raw fingertip at the end. So I don't recommend that. You'll find that with some of the sandier feeling papers with the rougher textures. You might want to consider wearing gloves even. I know quite a few people who work on UART paper who wear gloves. It's not something I've become comfortable with yet, but maybe if I want to do a larger piece on this particular paper, I might consider it. So now I'm coming in with BV3, just adding a few rough highlights where the light's catching the cushion. And you can see the lovely texture of the paper. I try to leave a little of the texture showing. That roughness works quite well for the texture of the cushion. And using BV15 at the top of this crease, just bringing some of those little lines down the cushion. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in the backdrop. This piece was only 8 inches square, so quite a small experiment. And sometimes the less detail you go into on the background, the better it is for the main subject. It really helps them pop out of the picture. I just want to create some nice gradients of colour and lots of different purples that will reflect beautifully in Harry McClary's glossy coat. And if you haven't tried UART paper before, it comes in several different grits from 200 to 800. And this was the 400, so right in the middle. And I also have some of the 200, which is rougher in texture. And the 800 is their finest texture, so I would like to try that one too. And it really is amazing how much of a difference different paper makes to your overall effect. One paper behaves so differently from the next. You can use your same techniques on it mostly, but you will get a slightly different appearance to the finished piece. And here I'm using a black conte crayon. So this is another black stick that I sometimes use. They're not quite as soft, I find, as the Faber-Castell. They're slightly softer. The conte crayons are a little harder, but quite a good black pastel for finer detail or lower layers like this, where I'm just plotting in the fur. And I wanted to try to not fill the paper too soon, so I went with the harder pastel, which won't fill the nap of the paper too quickly. I wasn't sure how much UART paper could take, but I quickly found out that you can apply many, many layers on this paper and still be able to add a very light mark on top of dark pastel. It's very, very good for accepting lots of layers. So if you're just starting out with pastel and you're using papers that perhaps weren't designed for pastel, you might find, or this you might associate with the medium, that it's very messy and that everything goes very muddy and mixes too easily. Well, this is exactly why there are pastel papers designed to take many layers and not go muddy very quickly on you. So it's worth trying out a few different papers. I always recommend experimenting. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that I love velour pastel paper. But the more I experiment with other papers, I can really see the benefits of them. And for this portrait in particular, I think the rougher texture of paper worked really well with the wiry, rough hair on my little dog. He's got quite wiry old whiskers on his beard, and I thought that the rough texture of this might actually help me achieve that. So I'm still working with the black conte crayon, just trying to block in some of the darkest areas and plot out a bit of his fringe and ears. And now I come in with one of the dark purples, dark 13. And start to blend some of that colour into the black that I've already applied. And you can see even when I just rub over the black areas, it sort of fills in the gaps a bit, gives me a bit of a mid-tone to go with. And I just used a light coloured paper for this. That's why often a mid-tone can be good, especially for a darker dog. So quite often I would use either a sandy colour or a grey if I were working on a dark dog. It makes a lot of sense to start from a mid-tone, and then you can work your way both darker and lighter. But in this case, on the lighter toned paper, I can just use all my rich purples. And this is BE23, a lovely plummy purple. And I just use those colours to fill in the gaps and give me some mid-tone colour in there. And that's what I continue doing for a while, just figuring out what colours to add into this coat on top of the black to give me a good base to start adding my lighter colours and highlights. And I make use of a lot of pastel pencil in this piece as well, partly due to the scale being only 8 inches big, but with a lot of the detail in the fur and the very finer edges, the pastel pencils are perfect. And I just start to drag some of those finer hairs around the edges of the ears. So continuing now with dark 14. And when I look at the photo reference, I know in my mind that it's a black dog, but I'm really trying to see all the different colours reflected on that dark coat. And I pick up some BV15 now, getting a bit lighter in my colour choices. And on this side of the dog, you can see that it's in a bit more shadow than on the right side of the dog. That's where the main light source is coming from. So I want to try and save a lot of my darker and mid-tone colours as my brightest colours over on this side. And that's the first thing I do really when I look at a photo reference that I'm going to paint. Figure out where the light source is coming from, which side of the subject is going to have the brightest highlights, which side of the subject will have nice light edges. And that's really important then to keep in mind throughout the whole painting. So I'm not leaning very heavily on this paper. The softer the pastel you use, the easier it will go onto the paper, so you'll get more pigment on the paper. And with the unison pastels, I find I can create nice sharp marks. Even though it's a soft pastel, it doesn't crumble. And Harry McClary's got such an interesting little face. This is the first time I've painted him, and he was extremely difficult to capture. He's got such an unusual expression. And the messiest of hair that seems to sprout out of everywhere. No matter how much I brush the whiskers around his face, they always go their own direction. So he makes a very interesting character to paint. And I just spend a bit of time here blocking in more of the dark on his face. I really wanted to work on one area of the painting, like that top left ear, just to see how the paper was going to behave, how it reacts. And once I've got that much done, I felt a little happier about blocking in some more of the face. And again, those lovely, rich purples. I'm just trying to shape his eyebrow here. You don't have to be very precise with your first layers, just to get some colour blocked in. Pretty much like any other pastel paper that I've tried, the UART paper really only starts to behave itself a little when you get a few layers of pastel onto the paper. So if at first you're being very cautious and not putting on too many layers, that could be a problem. You could find it difficult to blend, difficult to soften the pastel into the paper. You really need to have a couple of layers on the paper before things start to move around nicely and blend into the lower layers a little. On the other side from that though, if you go too heavy-handed in the early layers, you're going to fill your paper with all one colour of pigment. You might notice it quite often to build up a colour or an effect. I use several colours, several layers, just to give it a more rich appearance. Whereas if you really lay down your early layers of pastel thickly and you don't rub it into the paper, it's all sitting on the surface of the paper, you're going to find it very difficult to add lighter highlights and other tones later on if you oversaturate the paper. So there is a happy medium. Experiment with how heavily you apply the pastel, and just remember not to press too heavily with the softer pastels, as you will fill the paper too soon. So you'll notice after using a little bit of BV9 as a highlight, I also use a blue pastel pencil, which is a similar sort of shade. And I found that the pastel pencils went onto this paper really quite nicely. Sometimes it's difficult to get strength of colour from the pastel pencils, especially over darker colours when you're trying to get a light colour to show up. But I find that on this paper it went on pretty well. You still don't get the same strength of colour as you do from the soft pastels, but that works across the board on all papers. But I definitely make use of a selection of different colours of greys and blues, as well as my black pencil in this particular piece. And I continue for the next while with the pastel pencils, just trying to tweak what I've already done, see what level of detail I can manage in this top corner. I found that while I worked on this, it was quite easy to smudge the rest of your work. So I was leaving the rest of the face clear for right now so that I can lean my hand on that area. And now I start into Harry McClary's eyes, and I left the eyes in this project so that you can see how that works on UART. And again, I just followed my usual techniques, using the pastel pencil to outline the eye really carefully, looking at the shape. Each little bend and curve, it makes such a difference to the overall expression, so I'm really careful when I'm doing this part, trying to get the angle of the eyes and each little area correct, as it really changes the overall character of the subject. And in this case, Harry McClary has got such an unusual little face, I really have to double check everything. But I was quite surprised that even on this small scale, I could get a lot of detail on this rougher UART 400 paper. I can't say I'm the biggest fan of the rougher papers, and I think I would like to change my technique a little, paint a little more painterly on the rougher papers, making use of the lovely texture of the paper. So I would like to experiment with this paper, perhaps for a still life or a landscape, or I have some wonderful street scene photographs that I would like to try. And I think this paper would be great for that. Whether I'll use it for many animal portraits in future, I'm not too sure. But for an animal with particularly rough or wiry hair, like Harry McClary, I think it was actually perfect for that, as I was really able to get that unusual texture on his coat. And I'm not sure that I would have been able to achieve that quite so easily on the velour paper that I normally use. So you can see how dark it is in behind his eyes. He has quite a large fringe overhanging, and it creates a lot of shadow in there. So I really have to block that in pretty solid black to begin with, and trust that my paper will allow me to add some little flecks of lighter colour to break that up. But where it's really dark in a painting, you really must create that contrast if you want your highlights and everything else to come alive. You really need that initial dark contrast before you start to add any lighter colours. And now with some A33, starting to pick out some of the lighter highlights. And you can see as I drag the pastel, the lovely texture of the paper, and then rather than really rubbing it into the layers underneath, I'm more just pressing it, blending it very lightly. I don't want to lose the definition in my mark, and I do find that this paper blends a little more easily than the Pastelmat or the velour that I use. You can really rub at it. But with this paper I found it was better sometimes just to press lightly. And this is something that you really need to experiment with, get a feel for the paper that you're using. You know that if you rub too hard and you lose all your definition, that next time maybe try a different approach. And it's through trial and error like that that we all learn how to use different mediums and papers. But I know that a lot of people, when they're starting out with art, you don't tend to have a lot of money to spend on art materials, and good quality art materials are often expensive. And if you want to try the good quality materials, you want to be sure that the thing you're buying is something that you might actually like. So it's great to be able to come on and access so much content these days where you can literally see what the paper is like and how it behaves before spending the money on it. But my advice is always to try and get yourself a little selection. Some art shops, you can get a selection of different pastel papers, one sheet of each, which lets you try lots of different papers without having to buy expensive pads of paper. But where you can, always buy an individual sheet rather than a full pad until you know you really like the paper. So just working around this left eye. Trying to create that nice sweep from the corner of the eye. And you'll notice that all the purples I'm using in his fur are the same purples I used in the background. So it's always good to have that colour harmony between your background and your subject. Especially if it's on a light coloured or dark coloured dog that might reflect a lot of colour. And just within that darkness behind his eyes, when I look closely at the photo reference, there are lots of little hairs sprouting out towards me. But I can really only see where the tip of the hair picks up the light. So I'm just hinting at them with these little marks and blending them back into the black a little. But that's enough of a hint to give the impression that those hairs are growing out towards us from the darkness. And I'm really just aiming to break up that solid black area that I laid in earlier. And you can see, because I've got that nice dark contrast in first, these lighter marks all show up pretty nicely. And then I can re-darken in between some of those hairs. And the same for in here using grey 35, just breaking up some of the solid black that I've already applied. And now using BV3, one of my lighter highlight colours, and I'm using so many of the BV range in this piece, all those lovely blue violets. Picking out those eyelashes that are catching the light just above this eye. And I use some of the lighter coloured pastel pencil just to try and tweak my bigger pastel marks into shape. And now I'm back working on the eye, and I've speeded this up a little bit just so that I can squeeze both eyes into this project. And you can see I'm using my paper tortillon, which has a much smaller point than my fingertip, just to blend the colour and rub it into the paper. Using my nice BE6 brown first of all. And always making sure to keep that accurate outline of the eye there with the black pencil. And this eye is really in the darkness, so there's not a lot of detail that I can add in there. It's so dark. And I'm just trying to plot out where the highlight will go, as that will be so important. And I'm just using my pencils to try and figure out exactly where to place the highlight. And there's a little bit of reflected colour just on the bottom of the eye there. And I used the soft pastel, but the pencils and the tortillon just to shape it into place and blend it slightly. And that's really about all I can do for that eye. It really was in so much darkness. Once I get the other eye in, which has some light hitting it and a lovely reflection, then usually the eye that's in a bit of darkness comes alive as well. So the effect of both eyes in will hopefully help this eye that's in darkness. But I work at adding some smaller reflections, trying to enhance what I can see in the photograph. And you can help yourself out when you're painting a difficult portrait. Bring your photo reference into some editing software. Lighten it where you need to. If you're working on an eye that's very dark, lighten it enough so that you can at least make sure that the outline of the eye is accurate. So I do a lot of editing at the photos while I'm working on them, if there are areas where I can't see the detail. Just bring in some more of those highlights. I still wasn't 100% sure what highlight colours I would use, so I think I've experimented on this left side of the face quite a lot. Experimenting with the movement I make as I drag the mark down the paper. But overall, I really enjoyed working on this, apart from the raw fingertips afterwards. But I really enjoyed the texture of the paper and how nicely it blended together. Definitely quite different from what I'm used to. And again, I come back in with the black conte crayon. And don't worry if you don't have harder black pastels. I tend to use them on my lower layers, as I said, so that I don't fill the paper too quick. But you can also use your softer black pastel if you have Unison Black or another brand. This will work fine too. So all I've really done is continued darkening. and worked a bit more at this ear on the right, which I'm now blocking in with some of my purple tones. And I start work on the right eye, which will hopefully really capture little Harry McClary's gaze. So a similar process as before, only this time the eye has a little bit more detail that I can see. So almost as soon as you get a highlight onto an eyeball, it really does bring it to life. And you can see how having that extra bit of reflection on this eye all of a sudden makes the other eye look fine. So if you've got the outline of them accurately, but one eye is very dark, you'll still get a good likeness as long as you've got that outline and the eyes placed in the correct place. So now that the top half of his face is coming together, I start to work at blocking in around his nose and muzzle area. Again, just the same thing with the little black conte pastel and marking in the rough direction of the fur as I go. And I've also left the nose in this project so you can see how quickly this was built up. Just blocking in the darks again, outlining the nose with the black pastel pencil. And again, I've speeded this up slightly just so that I could fit the full piece into a 1.5 hour tutorial. In total, I think this little painting took me about 4.5 or 5 hours in total. So it's not that long, but I think mainly most of that time was spent figuring out how to work on the paper best. So I think if I work more on this paper, you can produce lovely effects in quite a short time. And now he's got such a collection of whiskers down both sides of his nose. And I start off with a little bit of A33. Something not too bright, as those hairs at the top of the muzzle are very much in the shadow and I don't want to make them too bright. I want to really save my bright white for that right side of his mouth where it's the brightest part of the whole painting, really. And I want to avoid using too much white anywhere else. So lots of my colours like BV3 here, lilac colours going down first. And really you want to start looking at dark and light as more than just black and white. Try to see different colours, how you can add a highlight or add interest to a dark area by adding different colours in there. Always try and search for different tones, something more interesting in value than adding either white to something to make it lighter or black to something to make it darker. Both black and white have important uses. I do use them a lot, but they're at the extreme ends of your values. So you want to make sure that you have plenty of colours in between. So I've been building up this area around the nose using some of my highlight colours, lots of those purples. And now I come in with a lighter pastel pencil and just start to plot out where some of his crazy, crazy whiskers go. And I think that's the most difficult thing about painting this type of dog with very unpredictable hair that sprouts in all directions. And I found that I could use the lighter pastel pencil. It goes on so cleanly over those dark colours. And I'm just really plotting the direction, not leaning too heavily yet. And we've had Harry McClary now for just over a year. We found him in the north of Spain this time last year, and he's been with us ever since. We now have 3 dogs, 2 Spanish rescues, and Brocky, my little dachshund, who we left Ireland with. And he has so much character in his face. I think he's stolen everyone's heart. And he's quite old. He has a lot of grey hairs. But similarly with people, I quite often find that an older face has so much more interest or character when you're painting. And this is BV1. Again, not my pure white. And just fanning those marks around the muzzle and underneath the nose. And a very light blend just to soften it into the paper. He also has some warmth in his coat. I don't want to make it too cold, which is why I sometimes bring in some plummy coloured purples, so with less blue in it. And here I'm using BE21, starting to add some of those warm reflections on the left of his face. But you can see, like I often do on any of the papers I work on, coming back in with my black again, just strengthening some of those areas. While you work on the piece, it's inevitable that you lose some of your definition. And I'm always coming back into those areas, redefining the direction of the fur and the dark contrast in between. I come back to work more on the nose now, and using dark 14, blocking in some more of the top of the nose. Again, with noses, they're dark and wet, very reflective, and they too will often reflect what's going on around them. So look for as much colour as you can see. The more you look for this, the more you'll start to see bright colours where before you saw greys. And it really does work like that. I've had so many people say the same thing as I found myself. When you start to look for the colours, then you really start to see them in everything. And it's just about training your eye to pick up on more subtle tones and just a bigger range of values. And once I've got those base colours down on the nose, I come back in with my black pastel pencil, strengthen some of the darkest areas before adding any highlights. And I also start to work at some of the whiskers that are the brightest on the right side of the nose. And I've saved pure white for this area. And now you can see how much that pure white really jumps out of the piece. So I know that this sunlit area will look nice and bright in contrast to everywhere else. And I continue now adding some more of the whiskers around his nose area, mostly using the pastel pencils, but using some soft pastel too, and then tweaking it into shape with the pencils. And now I'm back working on the nose, going to add a few highlights. And I take some of my BV9, not wanting to go too bright with the highlight initially, noticing some different colours on the highlight itself. Where the highlight comes round the corner of the nose, I can see that it's quite warm. And I'm just trying to add some different colours in there. And then soften it into the background so that it's not quite so harsh. But you can see, again, like the eyeball, with anything wet, as soon as you add a little bit of highlight on there, it just jumps to life. But of course that is dependent on you having enough contrast behind it to really let your highlight show up. And again, I come back in to strengthen those dark areas, especially inside nostrils. And now the last few bits of highlighting on the nose. And I really didn't spend that long on this little nose. Maybe 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes. And you can be quite suggestive. There's not a lot of detail in it. Just trying to get the right colour values. And as long as I make sure that that nice dark contrast is there, all my highlights are going to show up really nicely. Like this little lip that you often get around the bottom of the nostril. And once I get that in, it really gives that sunlit side of the nose some life. I used some little pieces of light 6, quite a peachy colour. Just trying to add some of those warm reflections on this side of his face. Again, trying to save all white for the other side of his face, and looking for other colours that I can use to create his white whiskers on this side of the face. But really take a moment to compare the two sides of his muzzle, how bright one is and how dull the other one is. And it's just all about finding the colours that are within that fur, even though you know that his whiskers are white. It's just about finding those other colours that will give the effect of how the light is hitting him. And I felt really on the home stretch at this point. I was quite happy with how I'd captured his little face. I really felt it was Harry McClary staring back at me. And I really was happy with this paper choice for painting a dog like him. The texture of the paper really helped me create those little twizzly shapes that are in each one of his hairs. It's a little bit like Chow Chow's hairs or a Pomeranian, if you know those breeds. We actually think that Harry McClary is half Pomeranian. He certainly has the Pomeranian stroke terrier attitude, but his fur does that slight frizz similar to them. And he has his grey hairs mixed in too. So yeah, the texture of this paper I just thought was really good for this type of fur. And I'm beginning to see that each paper really has its own pluses and drawbacks as well. But I think when you start to be able to choose the paper based on your subject matter, that's the best scenario, to have a range of papers that you can work with, and all of them good for different jobs. So that's my eventual aim, to broaden my style a little and be able to choose the paper which I think will be best for the overall effect. So I hope that I will get to experiment soon on UART again. If you haven't tried it already, it's definitely now on my recommended list. And this front area was quite tricky. I'm just trying to plot out where these straggly bits of beard come from. And I'll also need to make sure that I have enough contrast behind these areas so that my lighter marks show up. But you can see how I'm applying the pastel a bit differently here. Just very lightly dragging the pastel with a slight waver to my mark. So I'm not leaning heavily here at all. Just very lightly rubbing the pigment over the surface of the paper. And I'll continue to do that around his neck and chest area, choosing my different colour values, but making all the marks pretty much like this. And using some BE25 over here. Again, when you look at his face, another bright area is that area below his mouth to the left. And it's just the way the light's coming in. That area is curved around towards the light. So I want to pick out some of those straggly bits of beard with my lighter highlight colours. Again, saving pure white for the brightest area. But it's just all about noticing where is being hit by the light and whether that area is in shadow or if it's being hit directly by light and it's going to have bright highlights on it. It's just training your eye to notice the difference in those areas. And this is something that took me a long time, so please don't get frustrated if that seems really difficult at the start. It is really difficult and it takes a bit of practice. But once you start seeing colours in a different way, it opens up so much in your art. It really expands the possibilities within your painting so much more. So my advice is to just keep working at that. Look at lots of Impressionist art. They were the masters at using colour value to depict things loosely and still have it seem realistic from a distance. So I learned a lot of my colour theory from the Impressionists, and that's a good place to start when you're trying to figure out how to use colour theory in your work. So I'm nearing the end of this and you'll see me go between the pastel pencil, the lighter colours, and my soft pastels, just building up the detail in his neck and chest. All the colours that I've been using in the rest of his fur, just bringing those highlights on down his front. Trying to capture the wiriness. And not blending too heavily so that I lose my marks. You can see when I blend that it softens the marks slightly into the paper. I think I would find it quite difficult on the UART paper to create really soft fur, like there are some breeds of dog or different animals that I'm not sure I would capture quite so well on the rougher paper. But certainly for this type of dog portrait, it was perfect. But like everyone, I need a few goes on a new paper before I can feel really comfortable on it. So I'll have another try soon again. But I'd love to hear what sort of projects you like to paint on UART paper, if it's a paper that you use already. I'm going to order myself some of the 800 grit and have a go on it. I've got some of the 200 grit, but I'm expecting that my fingertips will not like it very much, as it's going to be even rougher than this paper. But I will give it a go. I'll maybe try something different on it, like a landscape or a still life. And I'll be sure to share those experiences with you here as well. But for now, I'll leave you to enjoy the last couple of moments of this painting. I'm just adding the finishing touches, mostly with the pastel pencil. And if you're painting along with me, I hope you've got hold of the photo reference, which is on my Patreon channel. I'd love to see some of your paintings from this. good luck with all of those whiskers. And let me know how you get on whichever pastel paper it is you're using. Next month's main tutorial is the Brindle Greyhound on Pastelmat, and that will be out in a couple of days' time. Thanks again to all supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate your support over there, and you're helping me a lot to create these videos and all the other content that I put out on YouTube. So it's thanks to you guys that I'm able to do this. And I'm just really encouraged by the feedback that I'm getting from you on the tutorials. As always, I really appreciate all your feedback as they really help me improve things. So until next time, happy pasteling.